Well, Abraham Lincoln posed this riddle. How many legs does a dog have if I call its tail a leg? Or here's another mind experiment. Can you draw me a four-sided triangle? Or here's another one. What about if the next Olympics has only winners and no losers? Now what's happening to your brain right there? I hope it's short-circuiting. I hope you're saying, wait a minute, you cannot take a word and make it mean anything you want it to mean. And that's exactly the world we're living in. And that's why we're talking about being relentless, not about being pugnacious, not about picking a fight, but being relentless in our spirit that words mean things. And ideas have consequences. And so we're going back to key words like male and female and gender. And today we come to a key word that if we don't know what it means, we will have semantic tyranny in our world. Anarchy from the use of words that don't mean something anymore. That's what's happening in our world. We're redefining words according to a philosophy of our world which is postmodern, which says your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. Why can't we all just get along? Not recognizing that these two railroads are headed toward each other on the same track. They're going to crash sometime. So we come to a word today that's absolutely essential for us, and it really is, in my mind, sort of the start of the train wreck that we're on right now. And that is the redefinition of the word marriage. Why can't two people of the same sex who love each other be married? When we first heard those words about 20 years ago, our brains went, whoa, wait a minute. You're using the word marriage in a context that it has never and can never be used. How many legs does a dog have if we count its tail as a leg? Can you draw me a four-sided triangle? Why can't two people of the same sex who love each other be married? This is a concern more for words than anything else. It's all about philosophies and what those words mean. And not to care about the truth of a word means that we don't care about what God says about those words. Here's what it says in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. So guys, I want to draw you down to the slogan that we've been using for this series, that disciples of Jesus are the first beachhead for grace. Remember, that's where we start. We're the first to land on the beach and find and discover the fire that's coming at us, and we come at that beachhead with grace. But we're also the last stronghold of truth. And so once having established the beachhead, we're not going away. We're staying here. And the summer is going to be all about that, the summer series of IronWorks. It's going to be all about establishing that. Look at this ancient document called the Defense of Marriage Act that the U.S. Congress passed, which says marriage is the legal union between one man, you can't say that, and one woman, what's that? As husband, who's an oppressor, and a wife who's the oppressed. I mean, just to read that phrase. This is so obsolete in our culture. You couldn't even say that. You have to redefine everything. In fact, Berean just defined, we're going through all of our documents to make sure that our policies all line up with our theology. And so now our new documents all say something like this. Marriage is between a biological male and a biological female, because man and woman no longer mean anything. And then we define marriage for what that is. This is the world we're in. It's a slippery slope. I can't decide whether to cry or rage this morning. That's why I need the balance of grace and truth. Relentlessness is not about my immediate reaction to the news. It's about my grounding in a biblical worldview and a discipleship mentality. It says I've got to be tenacious about the truth, but in a way that represents who Jesus is. The Defense of Marriage Act passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 342 to 67 in 1996. And it passed the Senate by 85 to 14. And the first crumbling of this from a national standpoint was in 2004 in Massachusetts, that redefined marriage when it said, we construe civil marriage to mean the voluntary union of two persons as spouses to the exclusion of all others. Now they put to the exclusion of all others. That no longer holds either. I just read this morning an article about how confusing this is. Because once you breach the meaning of a word, there are no boundaries. And when we were fighting for this definition of marriage in Minnesota, they said, oh, we just want to have freedom to live our lives. That's all we want. We said, well, you're asking for a boundaryless definition of marriage. And of course, that's where it is now. It's polyamorous, it's polygamist. It includes all kinds of combinations. There's no real exclusion to saying you could marry your dog or your iguana. I just read this morning that St. Thomas University, a so-called Catholic university, which has gone totally woke, sorry to all of you who've graduated from there, is now allowing transgender women, in other words, biological men who call themselves women, it's putting transgender women into women's dorm rooms without telling the other roommate. Now, they're going to find out pretty soon what's happening there, but they're not telling the parents. I mean, this is incredible. We're doing a whole redefinition of the word marriage. It's the first time in recorded history you can have a four-sided triangle or a five-legged dog or same-sex marriage. Jesus said in Matthew 19:5, a man shall leave his father and his mother. Boy, that's hateful. And be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is Jesus quoting the Genesis narrative on the definition of marriage. So he said it's male and female, it's a lifelong commitment, and it's to fulfill God's purposes for humanity. So let's examine this. I've given you some notes today that have lots of scripture on it that we can't fully unpack. It would take us a couple days to do it. I want you to save these notes because you're going to need them. Because we are so rocked every day by the news that we're receiving, or from family news that you're getting. I keep getting guys coming to me saying, let me tell you what's happening in my extended family. Let me tell you what's happening with my niece or my nephew, my son, my daughter, my grandchildren. You're going to need grounding whether you quote these verses to them or not. You need to look at them yourselves to be sound, to be able to be relentless about what this means. And so I've given you lots of scripture here. So let's defend the truth about marriage from special revelation. This is what God says. These are things we wouldn't have known if God hadn't said them and revealed them to those that wrote them down. So we're going to start in Genesis chapter 1 and at least read these verses 27 through 28. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. You know the next three words? Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. This is so fundamental that we are a gendered species. In fact, every species is gendered, but we are specifically named as male and female, and this maleness and femaleness is essential to the fulfillment of God's purposes for the earth, which is to multiply, which is part of the purpose, and to fill the earth and have dominion, to live out the image of God. There's something about the combination of maleness and femaleness that portrays who God is, because God is a community, and now He's made male and female to be that. In Genesis chapter 2, we get the story about Adam, who didn't... something came to him. He realized, I'm not complete. He was given the task of naming the animals, and he saw a male rhinoceros and a female rhinoceros, and he saw a male iguana and a female iguana. And then he looked at himself and he said, well, where's the corresponding me? I'm alone, and I'm miserable. You know, I'm driving my Mustang Turbo, and I've designed my own house, and I've got a chainsaw that works, and you know, I'm doing all this work, but there's no, I'm incomplete. And so God gave us the biblical foundation for naps. He put Adam to sleep. And He took from his side, yeah, if you need a biblical reference, there it is. But you have to wake up and look at your wife and say, wow, you're the one. And He took a rib from his side and He made Eve. And when He brought Eve to Adam, he went, oh my goodness. He said, Isha, you're the one. You're bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. I didn't know there was anything as beautiful and as attractive as who you are. And that was Adam. And this was planned, it was designed, and God provided. So it's not only a biological fact in the Scripture, it's a human longing fact that we're born to want someone in our life. We're not only born to want brotherhood that smells like this room this morning, we're born to want that someone who is uniquely attractive to us, who's called a woman and potentially a wife. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul is writing to a first-generation church in a city known for its debauchery and sexual profligacy, and he writes to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I won't read it right now, but basically he uses the words like he uses the word marry. He said, you should marry, each one should have his own wife, and you should be her husband. He, again, in a pagan culture that didn't know anything about a biblical worldview, never been to Sunday school, didn't go to Bethel College, didn't come to Berean Baptist Church, didn't even have the Scripture other than the Torah. He says each man should have his own wife, and you should be her husband. In Ephesians chapter 5, which is probably the crown of the New Testament picture of what it means to be husband and wife, male and female, Paul writes to the Ephesians, an equally debauched culture that had the temple of Diana on the hill. I've been to the ruins of that. And they had temple prostitutes where they went and worshipped through sexual acts. And I'll tell you what, they didn't have any problem getting men to go to church in the temple of Diana. Paul writes that a husband should so prize his wife that it's a model of how Jesus treats his bride, the church. And he uses male and female, man and wife, Christ and the bride. This is the intimate, sacred, perfect, earthly analogy of what Jesus is drawing his people to become. That's the bride. In Romans chapter 1, we have the sad summary of the demise of humanity into sin. We're not the first generation to wrestle with deviations from the design. This is ancient. This is thousands of years old. And it says, it starts in verse 21, it starts with their thinking, which became what? Futile. futile. Now, if there's anything that I want to avoid in my life, it's living a futile life. And Paul is summarizing the end of this kind of thinking is futile. The people who are thinking it don't realize that it's futile. But it's futile and it's dark and it leads to nowhere good. It says in verse 22, they claimed to be wise, but they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of God for something man-made. It's idolatry to the highest degree. And out of this darkness and futility, this bent and broken worldview becomes the redefinition of life. And the ultimate expression of that is not knowing who we are in terms of gender and sexuality. There are many, many sins that are equally bad, but Paul is just showing the progression here is the very denial of life itself. And as we read this, again, we don't know whether to cry or rage. But we need to meet it with prayer and grace. Because we're called to love this world that's described to us in Romans chapter 1. And we're called to be different than this world and have a voice in this world. And I'll be asking you a question in our sharing time, what we can do about that. I hope you come up with a good answer. And I just want to say that I've coined a word, I haven't seen it anywhere else, but we're not homophobic. We're heterophilic. You like that? Hetero meaning different, philos meaning love. We love the difference between male and female. And so you can try that in the newscast tonight when they stick a microphone in your face. So we can not only defend the view of marriage, and let me say, you know, we live in a culture where people are free to live the way they want to live. If they want to have a domestic, covenant, they can live that way. What I'm objecting to is taking a word that we own, and it's been so totally redefined now that we use it commonly. And I'll probably use it too, just because it's the simplest way to talk about things, but it's not true. There cannot be a marriage in the real definition of things between two people of the same sex. Even though we call it that. It's a five-legged dog. It's a four-sided triangle. But let's defend the truth about marriage from general revelation, from science and discovery. The slogan that's thrown out is, how can anybody's pledge to love somebody else threaten your family? What does that have to do with you? Just leave us alone. And I would say, I'm fine with leaving you alone, but you drove your car across my front yard and into my living room. And I'm asking you, hello? This is my property. I've lived here for thousands of years calling this a marriage, and you're coming in and you're stealing not only the definition, you're stealing the meaning of what that means. So human history for 5,000 years has not recorded any society that treated marriage as just a private enterprise. They all have some kind of ceremony. They all have some kind of belonging. And the reason for that is because of property and children and care for the next generation. It's called a family. We want to know who belongs to who. And this is a very costly, and we're seeing the dividends of it already. It's a very costly social experiment. Can you think of some other costly social experiments in history? I'll give you a couple. The one-child policy in China. Let's try to lower the population in China, and let's just say, okay, you can only have one child. Well, that lasted for about 30 years. They've just rescinded that, at least in part. But they've discovered that they have, last number I saw, they have about 150 million men who have no hope of ever finding a spouse. And they have a hopeless welfare system We hosted a couple of Chinese guys coming to the University of Minnesota, and they were very gracious and didn't talk a whole lot, but we wanted to ask them, you know what, but you could read between the lines. We said, why are you here? And they said, well, we're both the single sons of parents who are very prosperous, and basically our job is to come here, get a good education, go home, get a super paying job, because we have to care for 4 grandparents. There's nobody else. That's our assignment. And that's what's happening in China. The welfare system is going to collapse. Well, that was a social experiment. And it denied basic human desires and just the natural development of a culture. Another social experiment was the Soviet experiment that said, let's do away with private property. And let's all work equally. And let's all share equally. How's that working for you? Well, it denies human nature, which is basically selfish. And so some people work and some people don't. There's always going to be a grasping of power, and that power is going to be pounded into you by a boot heel. Well, that social experiment failed. Well, this is a social experiment, and it has no boundaries to it, whether they can be group marriage or adult and child. Can you believe the discussion we're having in our culture right now about grooming young people, children, for sexuality, and people are not ashamed? They said, well, that will never happen. That will never happen. Wait a minute, it's on the news every day. And people are not apologizing for it. They're saying, if you don't agree with this, you're being a hater. I want to read to you, because I can't say it any better. I want to read you a lengthy quote from Paul Johnson, who is a towering intellect. And he wrote a book called Intellectuals years ago about people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Karl Marx, Leo Tolstoy, Hemingway. And here's the final page of that large tome. He said, it is just about 200 years since the secular intellectuals began to replace the old clergy as the guides and mentors of mankind. We've looked at a number of individual cases of those who sought to counsel humanity. We've examined their moral and judgmental qualifications for this task. In particular, we have examined their attitude to truth, the way in which they seek for and evaluate evidence, the response not just to humanity in general, but to human beings in particular. In other words, they looked at their families. The way they treat their friends, colleagues, servants, and above all, their own families. We've touched on the social and political consequences of following their advice. What conclusions should be drawn? I think I detect today a certain public skepticism when intellectuals stand up to preach to us. A growing tendency among ordinary people to dispute the right of academics, writers, and philosophers, eminent though they may be, to tell us how to behave and conduct our affairs. The belief seems to be spreading that intellectuals are no wiser as mentors or worthier as exemplars than the witch doctors or priests of old. A dozen people picked at random on the street are at least as likely to offer sensible views on moral and political matters as a cross-section of the intelligentsia. But I would go further. One of the principal lessons of our tragic century, which is the 20th century, which has seen so many millions of innocent lives sacrificed in schemes to improve the lot of humanity, is this: beware intellectuals. Not merely should they be kept well away from the levers of power, they should also be objects of particular suspicion when they seek to offer collective advice. Beware committees, conferences, and leagues of intellectuals. Distrust public statements issued from their sacred ranks. Discount their verdicts on the political leaders and important events. For intellectuals, far from being highly individualistic and nonconformist people, follow certain regular patterns of behavior. Taken as a group, they are often ultra-conformist within the circles formed by those whose approval they seek and value. What are we seeing today? You do not cross the orthodoxy of the woke crowd, or you will be canceled, banished, protested. This is what makes them en masse so dangerous, for it enables them to create climates of opinion and prevailing orthodoxies, which themselves often generate irrational and destructive courses of action. Above all, we must at all times remember what intellectuals habitually forget, that people matter more than concepts and must come first. The worst of all despotisms is the heartless tyranny of ideas. Exactly. So, human history shows us that. Proverbs 1:20 says, wisdom calls aloud in the street and raises her voices in the public square. Well, let's look at human biology. And just a couple of quick comments. Same-sex marriage exists in utter defiance of basic biology. Because look at its telos, look at its end. Look where it's going. By itself, without borrowing, stealing, kidnapping from somewhere else, same-sex marriage is lifeless. It'll be dead in one generation. How's that working for you? So they go in and they find a surrogate, or they adopt children who, were born to a male and female, and they raise them. But the point I'm making here is that our anatomy was designed and prepared in a certain way, and basic biology contradicts the end result of same-sex marriage. By the way, amongst males at least, it's a much shortened lifetime, lifespan. There are all kinds of sexually transmitted diseases in the gay lifestyle. There are horrid medical complications that we don't even want to describe. And, there's extinction at the end. I put this diagram in your notes. It's called personhood theory. This is the worldview, in short, of why people are supporting abortion, clamoring for abortion, and why they support same-sex marriage and transgender ideology. It's a two-story view of humanity. That on the upper story, the bottom story is, this is your body. This is, by the way, this is Greek theology. This is Gnosticism. This is basic Greek philosophy, that your body is this expendable biological organism. It's the husk, it's the housing, it's the prison. But your real person is in the upper story. This is your moral and spiritual identity that you have. And this is the split. So I was born in the wrong body because my personhood tells me I don't feel comfortable. And I just want to challenge people, nobody feels comfortable looking at their own body. We're all dysphoric in some way. But they sever the body from the person. This is why a baby can be at 9 months coming through the birth channel and its life can be taken because it's not a person yet. It's just a body. This is a despicable, horrible, Holocaust kind of view of humanity. I've been reading another book called Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey. I want to read a little bit of her reasoning to it. Sorry, we're going to go a little bit extra innings this morning. Here's what she says. To engage in same-sex behavior is to implicitly say, why should my body inform my psychological identity? Why should the structural order of my body have anything to say about what I do sexually? Why should my moral choices be directed by its purpose? The implication is that what counts is not my sexed body, the lower story, my gender, but solely my mind, my feelings and desires, the upper story. The assumption is that the body gives no clue to our identity. It gives no guidance to what our sexual choices should be. It is irrelevant and insignificant. This is profoundly disrespectful in its view of the human body. Well, she has more to write. It's a tremendous book. It's called Love Thy Body. And I find it bracing and encouraging to me to go back and review these things because, we get wobbly. We get thrown about by the winds that are going on. But it's a tremendous book. So we look at human biology and say, no, we're not a two-story being. And here's the phrase. You don't have a body. You are a body. You might not like it. Might not be working. Might not look the way that you want it to look. But we were born male and female. Now, when people struggle with that, we empathize. But that's a matter of dealing with the whole person, not separating it into two stories. Saying, well, if you feel this way, if you're 6'4" and you have a beard, we're going to call you Ginger. It's a complete split in who people are. So when people are struggling with that, we want to have empathy and counsel them and help them deal with whatever has disconnected their identity from their body. And then there's human development, which is obvious. It's so obvious. Every study we've ever seen confirms and affirms the sad and depressing fact that when children grow up without an intact family, they suffer. And I'm not picking on anybody here who's struggled with this. That's the hard part. I'm talking about heterosexual marriages. We know when children grow up with 6 or 8 different grandparents, it's confusing. Where do we go for Mother's Day? What's going on? It's really confusing. And it would have been so great if we could have come at the same-sex crusade and said, well, just look at how heterosexual marriage works. But actually, that's been the main weapon against us, and even against the church. But human development says that a mom and a dad at home raising children not only makes them more prosperous, it makes them healthier physically and in every other single way. But you add to that the confusion of sexual identity in a same-sex marriage, and it's a recipe for massive social chaos, which we have not yet inherited, but it's coming our way. Well, I want to stop, but I do want to say, how do we invest in the truth about marriage? And I will leave you with this, that it was very good as God created it. Here are some purposes you can take home and ask your wife how you're doing. That we are to mirror God's image by the dominion, the relationship, and the oneness in our marriage. We're to mutually complete one another, which is laying down your life every day for the one you say you love. We could do a whole series on this as well. And it's to multiply if God provides a godly legacy. As Malachi says, what is God seeking? God is seeking a godly offspring for his people. And one home can make a difference. One home can make a big difference. Your home can make a big difference, no matter where you are in the development of that home. Cain's home inflicted pain and death. Noah's household saved the world. Lot's house subsidized Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham's household became the father of many nations. Joshua said, I'm going to be the guy who stands. You go ahead and choose, but here's where I stand. Zechariah and Elizabeth raised John the Baptist, and Mary and Joseph parented God's own son in a household. And the Philippian jailer, when he came to Jesus, said, I got to go tell my family. And they were saved that very night, baptized into the church. One home can make a huge difference. So we're not just fighting an idea out there. We're not just trying to shout into the hurricane of the media. We need to look inside and say, am I relentless about not only what I believe, but now how I'm living with the people God has given to me. So you have some things to talk about. Hope you find the subject worthy of your discussion. Let's talk amongst ourselves.